if you don't know how words work and how they're commonly used, which is really the way that the ancients would more talk about grammar, then you can't effectively choose the right words to convey your meanings to your audience.
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Pudewa, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Chief Marketing Officer. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers. So, Andrew, you are a traveling man.
Yes, and the season is just about to start up again this year.
Yes, and you get to go places far and wide. And, of course, when you go to places, it's so that you can meet new people.
I do meet a lot of people. It's one of the great joys of traveling. I'm a little tired of TSA, hotels, and really sick of restaurant food, but I like meeting interesting people.
Yes, and we have on our podcast today such a person that you met. Actually, I just learned you met him 7 years ago at an HSLDA conference.
Yes, well, I didn't remember that 7 years ago, but I did meet him last year at the same HSLDA.
Yes, and you came home from that conference and said, Julie, we need to get him on our podcast.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
And here you are, Tim. So welcome to our podcast.
Timothy Knotts from Connecticut, where it's probably a little colder than it is here, I'll bet. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's lovely to be here with you.
Well, tell our listeners the brief history of who you are and what's your background, how you got interested in classical education, rhetoric in particular, and then we'll go from there. And I have a couple questions I think that everyone will love to hear your answers to.
Yeah, it's hard to make it a brief story because it was one of those long and winding paths that many of us take to get from one place to another that we didn't anticipate arriving at. But I really started down the path as a college student. I was getting my teaching credentials as a secondary educator in history and political science, and found much dissatisfaction in my practicum teaching experience that led me to instead turn aside and go to law school. After law school, I practiced law for quite a while. My wife and I had some children, and as we began trying to figure out what kind of education we wanted them to have, a friend of ours gave us a copy of The Well-Trained Mind, and another friend a little later invited us to visit a classical conversations community. And through those things, I really was introduced to a whole different way of thinking about education that I hadn't previously known. And through a lot of reading and chasing down people who know things to ask them what I needed to read next and where I should follow along to continue to learn and grow, eventually arrived at the conviction that classical education is the best mode of education and sort of immersed myself in it.
What attracted you the most? Because you had young children, and so many people think of classical education as this thing you do in college where you read really hard books and you have these Socratic seminars and then you write these long philosophical type of papers. And so a lot of people, when they hear classical education, they don't think, well, that's something you can do with 6-year-olds. And so what caused you to kind of see in what you read and the people you met moved you into this idea that, wow, little kids can do stuff and it's significant and valuable?
Well, two-part answer to that question. First is I saw older kids doing the things that you were talking about and said, I want my children to do that. And what do I need to do to get them ready to do that? that's part one. But part two, a lot of the foundation of a good classical education is having exposure to myths and legends and stories and fairy tales and fables and personal histories and the history of your people and your place and the freedom to play and explore. And all of those things are the things that I knew just experientially were quality education and what is good and appropriate for young children to do. So I wanted to have that for my children, that they would have that appreciation for the things that build and are the fundamental roots of culture.
Yeah, I think so many people maybe have had that experience, and many people haven't, which is, walking into a class of teenagers, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and observing this remarkable high level conversation that they are capable of when, their training is sufficient, when the environment is appropriate, when the tutor, the mentor, the teacher, has even a little bit of training and direction that way. And it can just kind of blow your mind. Well, this is so different than what you kind of normally see in I don't know, I wouldn't call it normal, average, common high school group. And there's something about that that's just profoundly attractive. I got to tell you a funny thing, Timothy. I was asking Chat GPT about myself, right? Because, you used to be able to Google yourself, but now you can have a whole AI tell you all about yourself. And the most ridiculous thing said, Andrew Pudewa is the author of The Well-Trained Mind. So I asked, could you please cite your source on this? And it came back immediately, said, sorry, I was wrong. Susan Bauer is the author of Well-Trained Mind. But it made me almost afraid because the way in which, those AI large language models respond as if they know everything and this is the actual truth and fact. And if you don't question it, you could walk away believing completely wrong information. And so, I think part of what we see, a lot of in the classical and even in the not so classical, but just the common sense education revival is we really have to teach students to question and ask better questions and have, the buzzword is critical thinking, which I really don't like because it's overused and people who use it can't define it. But in this modern age of this artificial information, it's not just artificial intelligence, it falls short of that. It's artificial information, and people are going to be so willing to believe. I mean, I might have believed it if I didn't know differently that I had not written that book. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how do we cultivate that? And I don't want to say skepticism, I guess healthy skepticism, but, children today, they have to know you can't just believe everything a screen or even a voice tells you anymore.
Yeah. I think that's a perennial problem that's just been exacerbated or blown up by the accessibility of first Google, as you said, and then now even maybe more dangerously artificial intelligence. They're fine sources for beginning an inquiry into something. If you want a quick survey overview and then you're going to dig in and find out more, it can be a fine place to start, like Wikipedia used to be. But yeah, I mean, as a classicist, I think taking our cues from Plato is always a good place to go. And he would argue that information that's just a piece of a piece of knowledge, it's not the whole of it, right? It's the beginning of something. He would call it an opinion. I have an opinion because I heard someone say something or I read about it on the internet. It doesn't become actual knowledge until it's somehow tied down, either by testing it by experience or by testing it against common sense or testing it against what other experts or people that you trust know, to where it becomes sort of a weight of things instead of just I read that somewhere.
We spent some time recording a podcast, and we'll put a link in the show notes, where, Andrew, you talk a little bit about the dangers of AI and people believing that they actually came up with these ideas,
Right.
and they didn't. And so I will just point you back to that. I loved your question, Timothy, what to read next. I love that you, as an adult, were trying to find someone to give you some ideas. And I know our listeners would be like, yeah, I want to see that list.
What's the pathway you walked?
Right.
Yeah.
But I also want to just kind of take a moment to have you share this idea of how to get ready for that. And I think, Andrew, you described that is walking into a high school room where students can have intelligent conversations with each other and be intentional and care that they're learning something. And I think that leads us to really what we're talking about today, is this idea of rhetoric. And what does that word actually mean?
And what are its foundations? When does it start, and what are its foundations?
Yeah, and how do we get our kids ready to have those conversations where they're not dependent upon ChatGPT or any of these other AI?
All right, Timothy, she asked you two big questions there.
Yeah, maybe more than two. I had a really wise mentor who pointed out that there are many good and great books that are just not the right book for you, or at least not yet. And along the way, there were a lot of missteps. I picked up books that I saw someone recommend, or someone recommended to me directly, that I wasn't ready for yet. And it led to a lot of frustration and uncertainty about things. So there are books that are beautiful and good and really heavy and complicated that maybe aren't the best starting spots, but more of something to be encountered later in a journey of reading. So finding where you are and what is the next good thing is a very personal journey, I think, because if you don't have a background in education, there may be some books that would be great to understand first about education in general before you dive into the deep end of the pool about classical education. Or there may be books about child development, or a classical view of the soul, or maybe even other skill sets or basic information that are a gap, because we all have them. And
Can
so
you name a few of your ones that you would recommend in a quick elevator talk to someone who said, that sounds so cool, what should I read? And you got 20 seconds to give them a few titles.
Quick elevator speech. Well, again, for a younger family, The Well-Trained Mind is a good introduction to a way to approach a classical education, especially younger children, to prepare for that journey. As a more adult reader, Clark and Jane's The Liberal Arts Tradition was very, very eye-opening to me and important on my own journey, not for maybe a beginner who's never read anything about classical education, but it's not that deep end of trying to read actual philosophy, or maybe, again, something a little farther down the road, David Hicks's Norms and Nobility. But
that's a pretty stiff book.
I was just going to say.
That's definitely for the
that is dense
end of a journey, not the beginning.
Yeah.
Well, and I also can't help but think, Andrew, of our writing method and how we teach writing. We do take it down to that smallest step.
Right.
Even starting as early as copy work, you keep promoting the value of copy work, but we eventually get into the persuasive essay and actually the classical arrangement model that we have in our Bible-based writing lessons and a few other resources. So having that step-by-step, having that pathway, I think that's what we all crave. Like, tell me what to do next.
Well, it's interesting because all truth is God's truth.
Mm-hmm.
And you can find truth in many places, but sometimes it's confused with other things. But, I think we have built on, to some degree, the phenomenal foundation that Maria Montessori set for
Yes.
how young children learn, continuing on with Charlotte Mason philosophy, very much. Some people ask, is there a conflict between Charlotte Mason and classical? And I think the best answer is, well, if you look at classical and kind of reverse engineer it down to little kids, you'd end up with Charlotte Mason. Lots of memory work, time outside, literature-rich environment, not stressing so much about the technical side of academics with young children. And I think that's one fear that parents have, especially if they have a child who's got, a challenge like dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADHD, auditory processing. They would kind of think, well, there's no way my kid could do that level of rigor, whatever they perceive that to be. Maybe they visited a classical school and went into the second grade classroom or something. But the philosophical foundations there, and then, moving forward. So, Timothy, are you still lawyering now, or are you doing something else? Or are you lawyering on the side? How are you using your education and time? And how old are your kids?
I am not practicing law. I gave that up a while ago. I now write curriculum and try to write on the side some interesting articles and things now and then. I am a co-founder of the New England Consortium of Classical Educators, which is a 4-year-old endeavor up in the New England area to support classical education in our region. And we can talk some more about that because Andrew, you and I have something to share about that. And my children are 16, 14, 12, and 10 years old.
Mm.
Oh, you're right in the thick of it.
Mm-hmm.
The golden years.
Playing with all the different things with our family right now, and it's good. Starting to see some of the fruit of the early and middle years of an education with our 16-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And she is starting to flourish in some ways that show me that there were some good decisions made along the way.
That's such a delightful time, and it's, I think, reassuring for younger parents or parents whose kids are younger to hear stories of how other people's teenagers are turning out well, or then they become young adults and they, thrive in higher education or whatever they choose to do. So you're probably in the great position to share and write more. So, people do tend to, I think, maybe fall into, or their introduction into the trivium is the grammar, logic, rhetoric. And some people have kind of taken Dorothy Sayers' idea and attached ages to that. So kids are in, quote, the grammar stage, or, quote, the logic stage, or dialectic, and, quote, the rhetoric stage. And I've always had a little bit of an issue with that because all three of those things can be taught, should be taught to children of all ages, but it looks different. The way you teach grammar to, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old children is mostly, I think, and what Dorothy Sayers was referring to in the Lost Tools of Learning essay is about furnishing the mind, the memory, memorizing those Latin paradigms, memorizing lots of poetry, building the vocabulary, building the patterns of syntax. And then, as they get a little older, then you can start identifying parts of speech and the rules that govern their behavior and kind of explaining the mechanics behind the language they're already familiar with. And then, of course, grammar can be studied, forever. I mean, it's kind of an infinite thing like math. You could just keep studying grammar your whole life if you wanted to. So there's not necessarily an end to it, but then it does kind of phase out. Same thing with logic. You look for opportunities to teach some logical processes to young children. And then again, you can study logic till your whole life. There's no end of that. And then rhetoric, people tend to think, oh, that's a high school level thing. But my interest is really, what's the runway into good rhetoric? If you want this high school student to shine in rhetoric, what are the components of rhetoric? We know the 5 canons, but the 5 canons isn't necessarily kind of a plan for developing those skills rather than, it could be, and maybe more needs to be written and said about that. But if you would maybe reflect on that idea that this grammar, logic, rhetoric are really not age categories so much as integrated skills that you continue to refine and practice. And then what is the best preparation for rhetoric when you have children that are younger than that typical age that we would label them, by Sayre's paradigm, rhetoric age students?
Yeah, you're totally right that grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric they're arts. They're something much bigger than the modern subject matters that we tend to pigeonhole students into studying. They're also not ages or even stages, though I think Sayers was onto something when she was pointing out that there are things about them that are compatible or maybe easier to approach at certain ages or stages.
Definitely.
But yes, I think ultimately the best preparation for being a rhetorician is to become a good grammarian and a good dialectician or logician. If you can't do those things well, then I think you have no hope of becoming a good rhetorician. If you don't know how words work and how they're commonly used, which is really the way that the ancients would more talk about grammar, then you can't effectively choose the right words and combinations of words to convey your meanings to your audience, which is fundamental to a rhetorician. As to logic or dialectic, if you don't wrestle with the ideas and how they connect together and how you can show a progress or progression from one idea to another idea to finally a conclusion that you want your audience to follow along with you, then you actually have nothing valuable to say to anybody when it comes to rhetoric. So I think grammar and dialectic are your pathway to rhetoric, or at least to the doorstep of rhetoric. But you're right, too, that there are things that you can do with a younger student that will ease them into that study of rhetoric when they arrive there. We all know, show and tell as a little kid, or, some kind of getting up and presenting in front of your peers in a classroom or at a co-op or wherever there's opportunity. And you practice the canon of delivery by standing up straight and by looking at your audience and by speaking clearly and at an appropriate volume level and not fidgeting with your body. Those are all things, micro skills that can be practiced with young students that will prepare them to become a better rhetorician when they are asked to stand and deliver an actual speech during a speech and debate competition or delivering an assignment that they've been given.
Or arguing in front of the Supreme Court someday.
Yeah, or standing and delivering a stump speech as a candidate.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have such a dearth of good examples of rhetoric in the public forum today. You go through a political season and you listen to these people who want to be elected to lead you in, local, state, or federal positions, and you just wonder, do they even hear themselves? And if they do, why don't they change? why don't they work a little harder on, as you said, using the better words in the better combinations to communicate more accurately the ideas that they want to promulgate? And I think it's so important when we have communities where children can observe, number one, older students and even adults doing this, which is why I am such a huge supporter of speech and debate, NCFCA, STOA. I wish every kid could have that experience to some degree. And then, of course, the training that then reinforces, but you have to have both. I think you have to have the environment that creates the examples that they grow up with, and then you have to have the technical side. One without the other really doesn't seem to bring the product that you want. So tell us a little bit about the New England Consortium and what you do. And then we have a conference coming up this year. I'm very excited. And who attends and what people might be able to expect if they're in that part of the world, or maybe they want to fly to that part of the world.
There are airports in that area, I'm pretty sure, right?
I'm pretty sure, yeah.
Well, at least one or two. So the New England Consortium, we founded several years back for the purpose of supporting and growing classical education in the New England area. There are wonderful and old schools up there. The oldest classical school in America is Boston Latin, but many of the schools that sort of still cling to the idea or the name classical have largely abandoned it in practice, or don't fully understand it. We have a lot of young parents who see that their school options are limited and want something different for their children. And we have actually a fair number of adults who aren't looking to be teachers or educate their own children necessarily, but want to continue to be educated and are seeking opportunities to learn and to grow and to have good conversations. And part of what it is to be involved in classical education is to be a perennial and persistent student. So we want to support those people as well. So we do put on an annual conference. It is July 18th and 19th in 2025 near Plymouth Rock. So yeah, if you're in the New England area and want to come check out the interesting historical artifact that is Plymouth Rock,
which is very small.
It is. It's actually pretty disappointing. I don't recommend it as the highlight of a New England trip. There are many other better things to see, but you would be in the area and could go be disappointed along with the rest of us.
I want to go to the Boston Library and see the Joan of Arc room.
Mm.
I was told by a friend that there's a whole room filled with, I don't know how many, but well over 12,000 books about Joan of Arc, who evidently is the third or fourth most written about person in all of history, which is kind of surprising. So I want to verify that. I've heard it, but I want to know for sure that it actually exists.
Many of our classical conversation students write about Joan of Arc when they do their Faces of History projects using the IEW materials to do so. So they're adding to that great corpus of writings about Joan of Arc.
Well, yes, they are.
So this year, our conference theme is really centering on goodness, one of the three transcendentals that are identified by the ancients as being part of what it is to be good. So, goodness, truth, and beauty together. And we've investigated beauty and truth the last couple of years. This year we're on goodness, and Andrew is coming to be our keynote speaker, which we're very excited about. There'll be all kinds of different sessions, some that are very practical, hands-on pedagogy kind of sessions, or sessions about how do we talk about things like fables and fairy tales and use them as preparation for further education. Some of them will be a little more on the esoteric side. So for those who like the deep end of the pool and want to talk about norms and nobility, we can do that.
Exactly.
But we also do other things during the year. We have several book clubs that we operate because, again, people where we live rarely find them satisfying around the area and in person. So we want to support people that way. We do teacher trainings so that we can help support our local classical schools who want to develop their staff and improve their own practice in the classroom or as administrators. So we have a lot of different things going on that we really enjoy doing. And again, our great goal is to have lots and lots of friends with whom we can do classical education together.
Awesome. And where can people find out about this event and your organization?
So we have a website through our partner Kepler Education, because they are sort of not apparent. Our first major alliance that we made as an early endeavor. So then we are at theclassicalconsortium.com, and you can find us there at the New England Consortium of Classical Educators. We're a sub page there. You can also email us at it's NECCE at theclassicalconsortium.com.
Great. And of course, we'll include all these links in our show notes. So, listener, if you're out for a walk and didn't get a chance to write that down, just come to our show notes and you can click right over to that. Well, Timothy, I think we're closer to being ready for rhetoric. If I were to summarize this, I would say choose a good pathway to improve your vocabulary, improve your syntax. I don't know, something like maybe IEW structure and style, perhaps. I don't know, maybe something like that. As they're getting older, and consider that logic type of writing or study. And by doing that, then they can help to lead readers to the conclusion that you want to have them embrace, and therefore now they'll become good rhetoricians. Did I say that word right? It's the first time I've ever heard it today.
Rhetoricians, yeah.
Rhetorician. It's a great word. So there we go. 3 easy steps, but a lot of hard reading in between, maybe.
It's a lot, but it's really rewarding to see where you can go and how much can be accomplished with just a steady diet of good intake and lots of practiced output.
And it's worth it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Time, as always, just whips by, but I will look forward to seeing you again personally in Boston for the conference. And hopefully we can continue our relaxed conversation in the spaces in between.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Enjoyed our conversation a lot.
God bless you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, please subscribe to our podcast in iTunes, Stitcher, or Spotify, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcasts. Here you can also find show notes and relevant links from today's broadcast. One last thing, would you mind going to iTunes to rate and review our podcast? This really helps other smart, caring listeners like you find us. Thanks so much.